So I realized that I have this unfair role that first I have to talk about dry glossary and terminology, and now after lunch. I don't know if I should take this as a hint, but okay. But I can promise you that once I'm through my slides, we will have another fascinating panel as we had in the previous section. So just keep your eyes open for another 15 minutes. I am going to look at ideas around evaluation approaches for D&I, including study designs, and then thinking about key metrics and measurement issues and how those might be resolved by thinking about our research questions as a starting point. So this visual is pretty simple, and it just tries to remind us that ideally when we start to think about design for a study, our starting point should not be thinking of which study designs are good study designs, which study designs are bad study designs, but rather what our research question might be, what kind of information we need to collect to answer that research question, and then that might inform us what kind of study design can provide that information. So this is just to open our mind and think that there are certain designs that are more rigorous for certain type of research questions, but being more broad in terms of dissemination and implementation research will be essential so that you can answer the actual questions that this field has. So I wanted us to, again, go back and reflect on what are the major research questions for dissemination and implementation research. When we are thinking of traditional basic or efficacy research, very often the question is, does this policy, program, intervention work? And usually it's implied that it's under optimal conditions and with selected populations. And that leads to certain study design approaches. Very often these studies use homogeneous select populations and settings. They try to control for confounding or contextual factors. And usually they focus on one or two main outcomes. And the answer to the question is, just to simplify it, yes or no. Usually very simple answers. When we move into the dissemination and implementation research area, our research question becomes a little bit longer. The question is more when, where, how, with whom, under what circumstances, and why does this thing work? And to be able to answer that question, our study design choices are going to be different. We are going to think usually of complex interventions with heterogeneous populations and settings. The context is going to be messy. And we are not going to try to control for the context, but rather try to account for it. So rather than getting it out of the picture, trying to understand it and measure it. And we are going to focus on diverse outcomes that are able to answer this very question. Finally, the answer will be obviously more complex. So just to take a different spin on this and remind all of us of this existing tension between internal and external validity in study design. Internal validity being the ability to draw causal inference by the extent to which a study minimizes confounding. And then thinking of external validity, it's the generalizability or real-world applicability of the findings. So clearly the design that we choose will be most likely maximizing one to the damage of the other, but there are ways to find balance between the two, and measurement approaches that are able to maximize this balance, and also just measuring all the confounding that we call confounding in traditional studies, and here more contextual factors will be essential. So I am stealing this from the same person who is sitting right there, all three quotes. But I think that these three quotes are wonderful to initiate our thinking. So what kind of study design do we want? The first one says if we want more evidence-based practice, we need more practice-based evidence. The second one, for every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. And then insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. So basically the designs that we want to use in D&I will be ones that can generate practice-relevant evidence. We want to use designs that can take care of this complex situation and not control for it, but rather account for it. And finally, we might want to reach out to alternative study design approaches than the traditional ones, although very often we will still be able to use our traditional designs with some modifications. Without the intention to be comprehensive or explain any of these in detail, I just wanted to throw out a few study designs and just approaches that you might want to keep in your mind when you are thinking of D&I. Adaptive designs, mediation analysis that is able to explain pathways, system science and complexity science that can actually take into account a lot of different stuff and messiness, mixed methods approaches that collect both quantitative and qualitative data, using theory-based approaches and realist evaluations. Some of you attended the webinar this Monday with Brian Mittman, and he talked more about this. Multi-level designs that are able to account for, again, the messiness and multi-level nature of D&I work. And some of us will still go back and use observational approaches, including observational comparative effectiveness studies, which you have great methodologies provided by ARC. There is also language for the comparative effectiveness research T, translational, which was coined, if I am right, by John Steiner and Russ Glasgow, and actually there is a chapter in the Bronson book on that idea. And very often, quasi-experimental studies will be used in this area because randomization is not practical or not feasible. And the one design that I would like to say more about is the pragmatic clinical trials, because those seem to marry the internal rigor with the external validity improvement. And so I will tell more about those. Before I do that, I wanted to show you that same study that we keep carrying through the day of the R01s, D&I R01s that were analyzed based on the abstracts, and show you what kind of study designs those R01s used. So the most common was quasi-experimental design, as I mentioned. Still a large number of randomized control trials are used. It's not specified if they are pragmatic or explanatory. System science had a very large number, which is really nice to see, especially they list here social network analysis. There were some case study approaches, CBPR, and then some of them were unclear, one of them, I guess. And then there were a number of studies that had multiple study designs included. And again, a number of studies used mixed methods. And this is over 46 abstracts, just to remind you. So pragmatic or practical clinical trials are the trials that we will just talk a little bit more about. Some of our presenters will be actually showing you examples, and you have already heard one by Ali. That was a pragmatic trial that they used. The purpose of these trials is usually to answer questions that decision makers have, decision makers being a very broad term, including providers, physicians, but potentially even patients who make decisions about on healthcare decisions. And very often they compare to an alternative relevant intervention. They recruit participants from heterogeneous settings, and the participants are diverse, and they include a broad range of outcomes. Obviously, saying that a study is explanatory or traditional clinical trial or pragmatic trial, yes or no binary, is not always true. There is usually a spectrum of study features. And one way to think about this is using the pragmatic explanatory continuum indicator summary, or PRECISE, that we have listed here. They basically developed the method of looking at 10 different aspects of a study design and measure whether on those aspects the study rates more on the explanatory or more on the pragmatic side. And one example is eligibility criteria. A study that is very pragmatic would want to include people from a wide variety of settings and with almost any kind of condition. With an explanatory approach, they are starting to exclude individuals based on potentially if they don't have high chances of responding to a treatment, or they don't have high risk of developing a certain outcome. With that, obviously, our conclusions that can be made are going to be less generalizable. Similarly to that, a more pragmatic trial will allow for some flexibility in terms of how the intervention is implemented. The more explanatory will want to train the implementers very well and rigorously control what's actually happening. And that's true for the other components. I don't want to spend too much time here. I did want to show you that there is a very neat way of looking at this in a visual aspect. It's called the spoke and wheel diagram. I always have to write it down because I don't know why I always forget, but this is basically the visual description of whether a study is pragmatic or explanatory across these 10 domains. And so obviously the study that is on the, for you it's on the right side, is going to be a highly explanatory study. And then the other side is the pragmatic trial, and then anything else can happen in between. So you can think about this resource, something that you can use, and I know that Russ might mention it, but there are some changes in this area, so I will let him talk about it. But this is something that has been tested with different types of interventions. And here are some readings that you will find online about design. I'm briefly going to talk about now measurement. Again, thinking about the main research question that we have in D&I of when, where, how, with whom, under what circumstances, and why does something work. We also want to be thoughtful about what kind of measures we need to collect. Usually we think about what to measure, how frequently, when, with what duration, and finally I would like to add that with what kind of instruments. This is going to be a key component of D&I research, the characteristics of the instruments or the meta information about the instruments. A few possible answers for D&I research might be to use diverse set of outcomes, including adverse outcomes and cost. We heard in the previous panel that most of the studies actually did account for cost, which I was really excited to hear, and I wanted to ask more about it. Using and collecting not only outcome measures, but also process measures, which will provide some understanding of why something happened in a certain way. Measuring at multiple levels, we talked about the multi-level approaches, and collecting data from various stakeholders, using a mix of quantitative and qualitative data. And then finally, I'm not going to go further, but practical measures would be important. Someone will actually talk today about what practical measures might mean in terms of D&I. These are a set of implementation outcomes that Enola Proctor and colleagues at WashU identified as additional outcomes that you want to measure in an implementation study. This set of outcomes has been used in the past for a number of additional initiatives. I will mention one in a moment, and it has been published. But there are some other ways of thinking about, obviously, outcomes and process outcomes. And again, there will be some more information about how you think about practical measures, but one differentiation between traditionally qualifying whether a measure or instrument is appropriate or not is contrasting the gold standard measure rating criteria with the practical measure rating criteria. The practical measure rating criteria is more focusing on the real-world application or applicability of the given instrument. And this is one way to think about that, including feasibility, how important it is to stakeholders, actionable, user-friendly, low-cost, do no harm, etc. And we will see examples of that in a couple of presentations in a moment. So you might ask the question, where do I find appropriate D&I instruments and measures? And good question. There are a couple of initiatives, ongoing initiatives, that are trying to catalog existing measures, and they use actually different approaches. The first one is the Seattle Implementation Research Collaborative. They have an instrument review project. They use a systematic approach of identifying instruments, and they are trying to reach across different topic areas and disciplines. They have developed rigorous rating criteria to rate these measures. They are in the process of doing that, and they are going to make these available on their website as a repository, and eventually they are going to make some recommendations based on a consensus approach. They have currently 450 instruments, and they are in the process of rating. Please look at their website, keep looking at it. Within a year, they are going to make them available. They are going to have publications coming out on the process in the coming few months. And this is just to let you know that actually they are using the CIFAR framework that Julie is going to describe to us in a moment to identify constructs that are important, and Enola Proctor's implementation outcomes that I just mentioned. And then the other approach is perhaps the other end of the spectrum, if I may say. This is using the NIH, or National Cancer Institute portal. That is a wiki-based portal. Some of you might know the Grid-Enabled Measures portal. It was developed to create a wiki-based platform for researchers using crowdsourcing approach. To make it simple, it's basically Amazon.com. The idea of having them submit recommendations for rating and comments about tools. And they have developed it for different kind of behavior science topics. We did develop a DNI-focused work initiative there, and right now we have 74 constructs and 130 different measures for DNI. They also have other topics of cancer survivorship and actually an EMR project that Russ led up. So you can, again, freely go there and use the resource. They have metadata on each instrument, which means information about the content and the validity. And we actually also did those ratings that I just showed you, the gold standard and practical ratings for some of the measures. And this is just a screenshot of that. Okay, I think that I am done here, but I have a lot of wonderful speakers to introduce you to. And the first one is going to be Ross Brunson, and he's going to talk about challenges from a public health setting perspective, talking about design and measures. I'll pull that up here.
Okay, you can hear? I do. Great. Hi, everyone. Everyone's awake? Let's see.
Thanks.
You did well, Borshika. Everyone stayed awake.
Good.
So that's my title. The messier it gets, the happier I feel. You know, I started out in cell biology way back when, and I'm about as far away from controlled studies of viruses in petri dishes as you can get now, and so the messy part is what I want to talk a little about. So this is opposite of what I think. So I like this quote, change the pronouns, but here we are, thinking about all of our discoveries. I think we're all really lucky to be working in this area of science and discovery, but our cup runneth over when we're thinking about our practical applications. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some practical applications, at least some studies involving practical applications for some of the work that my teams have been doing over the last few years. And I'm going to talk about a few challenges. Did we already do the 17-year, 13% thing this morning? Okay, so you know the basic challenges, that we got this long kind of leaky pipeline out there, right? And so we'll talk about that. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about a few vignettes from our work. And this is about mostly with public health agencies, state and local health departments. But if you work in clinical practice, I want you to think about how this might apply just as equally in clinical practice, because I think almost every one of the issues I'll talk about, there's a direct parallel with clinical practice. And then my 3 lessons. There's actually a lot more of that. So anyone know about Apollo moon shot? Anybody remember? Those of you old enough to know what Apollo was. There used to be this part with Apollo, and then when they got in trouble with Houston, we have a problem. And you could say that about this 17-year pipeline. We have a problem. The pipeline is leaking. You've got a lot of discovery going over here. We're spending $30 or $35 billion a year on health research. When you get to the other end of the pipeline, of the application of it, we have a problem. There's some leaks along the way that need to be fixed. I'll give you a couple examples of the disconnect for public health agencies. The left column is a study that we're just starting to publish now with local health departments. This is about 500 leaders of local health departments. We asked them how they learn about the latest research findings, and you can see the list here. The right side is about 250 of the leading public health researchers in the United States. We asked them the most effective ways that they reach practitioners. What do you see with these lists? Is there any problem there? And actually, the journal articles is a pretty distant fourth on the left side, and it's a very leading number 1 on the right side. And so you can see those lines don't exactly connect up the way we would like them to connect up. And there's a lot of other bits of data from the survey, but I thought this was one that illustrates well the disconnect. Another disconnect that's at a level, so we have state public health, we have local public health. Most of you heard of the Guide to Community Preventive Services? How many have heard of this? So this is the parallel to the clinical guide, the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, for public health or population level interventions. It's sponsored by CDC. It gives evidence-based recommendations basically about what public health should be doing. This is just differences, and this is in the physical activity part of the guide. This is just the difference from going from the state health department to the local health department, parallel in time, same survey, and you can see how different it is in the uptake of these evidence-based practices from state to local public health agencies. So there's another practice difference. So now a few short vignettes. This is the data on the community guide, and this is a study that we completed a few years ago, a CDC-sponsored study. And the basic idea was to look at ways of more effectively disseminating the evidence-based recommendations in the community guide. You can see at the bottom here the objective of the study listed. We worked with, and here the sort of unit of analysis here is a big one. It was 8 states, 8 state health departments. So the 8 treatment sites are state health departments. We had 8 control sites. And we started with sort of a national survey. So we actually surveyed the whole nation to start with, and then a number of the larger local health departments. We used a RE-AIM kind of framework with sort of diffusion of innovation in there as the method of moving through, knowing that about what moves innovations along the continuum. And then our stakeholders here were public health department leaders, people who had worked in health departments, who were currently working. We had an advisory group set up to help guide the project. And then with our 8 states, we had sort of local people appointed in each state to advise us as well. The main intervention here was a training intervention. Some of you may recognize David Satcher here. We managed to sort of kidnap him for a day and got him to do this is a physical activity study, and David is very active. And so we got him to kind of kick off the training and the video for this, talking about his own commitment to physical activity. And you can see the one about dancing here. You know, about dancing could be tough. This is a Far Side cartoon. We learned some of the same things about these interventions. You have to show people the advantage. You have to apply the Rogers diffusion, that you have to break down the intervention, the implementation of it in ways that practitioners can implement it, the complexity. So our training took into account a number of these factors that derive largely from Gary Larson and the Far Side. No, actually more from Ev Rogers and diffusion of innovation. We found awareness. There was we started at a lower baseline of awareness of these recommendations at the local level, and awareness jumped up more at the local level. So you could say that there was more room for improvement there. The later RE-AIM sort of variables, adoption, implementation, those improved more at the state level. We saw general patterns. We didn't see a lot of statistically significant changes, but we saw some things that helped inform that. So that's sort of part one in one health department study. The other one we're working on right now, that I just want to give one little bit of example from the data. The data aren't even fully analyzed yet, is working at a larger scale. It's kind of a bigger version of the first one. It's a cancer grant. It's working on sort of scaling up cancer interventions with public health practitioners. And the measures are not well developed, so we've got a number of steps here of developing the measures across a framework. We did cognitive testing. We've done reliability testing. We're now doing structural equation modeling. And we're also working on a separate part I won't say much about. It's sort of the parallel to the medical record audit, the public health record audit. Can you get into records and sort of document what a public health agency is doing? It's really messy, but we're trying to do it, and we'll see where it ends up. I want to tell the story. We started off this study with a sort of a version of the RE-AIM framework that we had already studied in a smaller study that sort of has these stages and some of the contextual factors affecting the stages. And we organized our measures according to that framework. And we ran the structural equation modeling here. You don't need to care about these, but these are just the factor loadings. And the framework didn't work at all. Basically, what we wrote in the grant didn't work. So what do you do? We had long discussions. We had discussions with our team, with other experts at the Cancer Institute, other places, and we decided we needed to change our framework and see if we could find a reasonable framework that would work better. And so we found this one, which is from Canada. You can see a lot of the Canadian terminology of knowledge exchange and knowledge transfer. And if you look at just some of these bigger factors of sort of the main headings, these basically load up to be the factors. And this framework, which was not in our grant at all, is what we ended up and what we're going to plan to use in the larger study. So it shows kind of, what you start out with may not be what you need to end up with, and you need to maintain some flexibility. I would have never written this grant to say, oh, by the way, if this doesn't work, we'll try a different framework, but that's what we ended up doing. So, three little nuggets, three little lessons, I guess, that probably aren't rocket science, but the first one is to, rather than run away from the messiness, sort of embrace the messiness, that's the real world, as Borshika just told us. And so think about the methods of measurement, the designs that will help you sort of embrace this messiness. And these are just some examples. You've already heard from Arnie earlier about social network analysis, systems approaches, agent-based modeling, quantitative measures, and then don't forget about qualitative methods as well, or mixed methods approaches, which I see Borshika said I think was about 30% of the grants had used those. And I think that could be a real advantage in a lot of these grants, especially depending on the stage of where your D&I research is. Think about things that aren't academic. He didn't publish, so he perished. The listing of that disconnect between practice and academia might lead us to think we need some different intervention strategies than just trying to connect them up to our journal articles. And so this may not come as much in the early measurement part, but it might come about what your implementation strategies are the strategies that we think we would do to get promotion and tenure not well connected at all to what the impact is out in the practice world. And I think this notion of impact and what it means beyond academic impact, a lot of us here work in academia, and so our impact naturally is sort of the journal article, and I think for practice that's not the right measure of impact. So that's another one to think about. And then this notion that you've already heard about of practice-based research. Think about what's already going out in the world that you can evaluate through a natural experiment, taking account of what's going on. It's going to be messy, but it might tell us a lot more about what some of the most innovative things going on, which are often not well evaluated. But if we do a decent evaluation, the concept of evaluability assessment plays into this really well. We can end up with some really important new knowledge. Larry Green has written a lot about this, so I put one citation at the bottom from Larry's work. And this is especially important in, I think, lower resource settings with disparities, international settings, where there are big problems, there are things going on, but there's not an infrastructure for evaluation. So think about that, because it can not only add to the knowledge base, but it might be able to address some of these issues in areas with high disparities and high need. That's me. So I think that's my 10 minutes. Thanks.
So if anyone has one question, we'll be happy to give you the microphone. Otherwise, we are going to move on to last class for what I saw a hand or... Good. Well, we will just go through because there will be good discussion at the end.
Just one comment, Ross. When you're in Colorado, you need to say Larry W. Green. Okay. Because of the other Larry Green problem that you well know of.
Yes, I do. Okay. Thank you for that correction.
Perfect. And thank you, Borshika. I'm going to let you in on a little secret here at the risk of losing 15 seconds, and that is that Elaine and Borshika have odds-on bet that I'll never make it in my time because brevity is not one of my secrets. So I'm going to try and prove them wrong. And here's what we're going to do. I'm going to really do two different things, even though there are 4 points here. The first two is ask you to indulge me for about 3 minutes in one of my personal soapbox passions about the importance of practical patient report measures, and especially for primary care, and especially in the electronic health record. And then I'm going to do what my assignment was supposed to be, to do a case study telling you about how we did this with some practical measures in a example project and draw a couple lessons learned. So with that, why do we need practical measures. Most of us have some type of training. Those of you that are behavioral scientists have tons of training on how to create the perfect psychometric measure. And how do we do that? Well, generally how we do that is we ask like 200 or 300 items. And we ask the same thing 12 different ways. And then we get great internal consistency and great factor structure and stuff. What happens when you try to do that in a real world setting? Okay, it's a deal breaker. Nobody's going to do that. That's just one measure, let alone others. But thinking about particularly the real world of primary care and how many things that they have to do. So I don't think I'm going to read all of these points, or I'll never make my my time. But I do want to point out that there is an important need in the area of D&I science, as well as many others, to kind of have some harmonization, or what some people might call standardization. If we all use our own measure, I don't know how we're going to know Ross's study. How's that compare to mine? If he uses his own measure he made up, and I use mine that I made up. So, what we need to think a little differently. As Borsika said, her quote, maybe not keep doing the same thing over and over again, but there's no real firm guideline or book for what are the criteria. We know for a traditional measure kind of what these criteria are. It's a little less clear for real-world, practical, brief measures. On pages 31 and 32 are a couple of things that my colleagues and I have been involved with in terms of, and you can see a little bit of difference, hopefully some commonalities, but about criteria used in different projects, including the one I'm going to talk about there. But central to this, you could kind of nitpick what's required and what's additional. We broke them up that way because we figured if we ask about 8 or 10 things, people would say, forget it. It's just too hard. Nothing's ever going to work. So we kind of came up with these, but I'll come back to that when I'm finished. But you might want to look in your book about those. Okay, now the one that the next 2 slides I could go on and on about forever. But we all talk about big data. Having recently come from NIH, I can tell you what most people in NIH mean by big data. They mean taking a lot of data, like is already in a lot of healthcare records on diagnosis and healthcare utilization, and then adding primarily genomic or maybe biomarker data to it. And that's important, okay? It certainly is. But if we really want to truly achieve a notion of patient-centered care or really personalized care, I think we need at least 2 other types of data too. The one in red is what I'm going to talk about today, and that's patient report information on patient behaviors, patient goals, patient preferences, and that sort of thing. And this project I'm going to describe for you that we call MORE focuses on it. But finally, I think in addition, we need better data, and this area has exploded with GIS and other data on the fundamental or the social determinants of health as well. So this is the last of the soapbox speeches, but just thinking about now primary care and what can they use. I like to state the second fact. I believe, maybe Deb can tell us or others here, I believe Kaiser alone has spent over $1 billion on their EHR, let alone the rest of the country. But what's the one thing that's consistently missing? Not picking on Kaiser, because I think it's true pretty much of the VA and other places too. Just how much?
We've changed.
You have changed. Okay, yeah. Well, that's good to hear. So you can correct me there. So my challenge is, I'd argue that logically, it's impossible to say we're providing patient-centered care, okay, if we don't really have any of these type of patient-centered measures. So that's what my story is going to be about. This is a quick summary of the items that are used in a project to try and assess, being really masochistic, 10 different areas that are important to primary care that are seeing very, very prevalent problems. You can read down there what they are. They're a combination of the Framingham risk factors that you all know, of substance and alcohol abuse, and then finally mental health, for those of you interested in integrated care. The amazing thing about this story is through using a combination of this Grid-Enabled Measures website that's in your book here and expert panel from the Society of Behavioral Medicine, we were actually able to get some consensus around these and come up with a total of 17 items to assess these 10 things as a screener. Again, not a definitive diagnosis, comprehensive diagnosis, but as a screener. These items were put into an automated tool called My Own Health Report, in a project that I'll tell you about, and there's a reference, I think, on page 30 by Alex Christ, is the lead investigator on this, a tool that automatically assesses and provides immediate feedback to both patients but also the healthcare team on patient status on these different variables. Here's just a shot of the website. This is publicly available. If any of you are interested in using it, it also was purposely developed through funding from the Cancer Institute, AHRQ, and Office of Behavioral and Social Science Research to be open source. So you can take it, it's developed modular, you can add or subtract to it. I don't have time to tell you, and there's not an answer yet because this study's in the field, but I thought this would be instructive because we're now we've conducted an earlier pilot, now we're doing what, here is a mouthful, a cluster randomized pragmatic implementation trial. And I'll try and just briefly describe to you what this is. We're using a delayed intervention design in 9 pairs of primary care clinics, purposely selected, if you remember the PRACES, the pragmatic criteria that Borska was talking about, to be almost as diverse as you can imagine. They are all over the country, as you can see here. They are urban, they are rural, they are ones that are leaders in primary care medical home. They're ones that haven't heard what that word is. They're one set that has a kind of a leader in the EHR. Others don't have any EHRs. Half of them are community health centers. The other half are kind of more traditional, non-integrated care, primary care settings. So I think I will stop there so I have a chance of making my time. But this project is in the field and you have the reference there. The key outcomes of this study, and this is something that you might either say, that's kind of interesting, or you might say this is a waste of time. We're not trying, remember, we're looking at 10 different things, and this is all adult primary care, as close to all adults that come in if you can. Because of that, we don't have one usual primary outcome like NIH has. It's not like diabetes control or hypertension control like in the earlier study we talked about, or depression, because not enough patients have. There's a whole mix of that. The primary outcome is, can this tool be consistently implemented and used to provide goal setting, an action, a shared decision making, and set a personal goal with patients. Those are our outcomes. And with that, I'm down to my last slide, unless you have questions. The lessons learned thus far. We should have results from this trial within about another month. It's a rapid trial. But the first 2 were frankly fairly amazing to us. Almost all the stakeholders, including patients and a variety of different primary care providers, found these items to be relevant, useful, and actionable. They could do something with, despite really low literacy levels in some of the clinics. That these made sense. Admittedly, in some of the community health centers, 1 or 2, they had to read the items to the patients because they were functionally illiterate, but still they kind of understood what the questions were and things. Second, even more amazing, particularly given the political climate today, it was actually possible to get people to agree, to come to some consensus across, and we purposely took all sorts of different stakeholders, from researchers to practitioners to policymakers to patient advocates. The last 2 might be more important take-homes or takeaways. There's no such thing, at least from my perspective, as a perfect measure. Okay, and often, as a lot of my CDC colleagues tell me, trying in this area, in this messy world that Ross described to you, trying to get perfect can often be the enemy of the good. And finally, on the basis of no data whatsoever, other than my gut level feel, is of these various criteria for this notion of these brief practical measures, we really feel that being actionable, and by that we mean providing some information that a healthcare team or a patient can act on and do something about. Okay, use that for improvement. and being sensitive to change, because the idea is that this project that we're talking about hopefully will be something that can be sustained and used to track progress, both individual patient and with the panel of patients over time. And I think I'm out of time. So thank you.